tonight. Panic, chaos, a staggering collapse. The Taliban have taken Afghanistan. Ben Solomon was in Kandahar just before that city was seized, riding with Afghan forces in full retreat. Ben is here to talk about how the country's fall happened in just weeks. Plus, Hind Hassan saw firsthand what could lie in Afghanistan's future when she and her team snuck themselves into Taliban-controlled territory earlier this year. Tonight, what she learned on the ground. And it's hard to dream up a worse failure of American foreign policy and intelligence. 20 years, 4 presidents, trillions spent, and thousands of service members killed. Liz Landers reports on how the U.S. political machine is responding to the Taliban's takeover.
Good afternoon.
This is Vice News Tonight. I'm Krishna Andavolu. How did this happen so fast, and why didn't we see it coming? That's what I've been wondering all day, watching the horrifying videos coming out of Afghanistan. And I'm not alone. Afghan leaders are blaming President Ashraf Ghani, who fled yesterday without warning the public or the rest of the government. Officials say Ghani made the country's problems worse by refusing for months to work with the Taliban to create a path for a peaceful transition of power. The acting defense minister tweeted that Ghani and his cohorts tied our hands from behind and sold the country. In the U.S., President Biden blamed, and I can't believe I'm saying this, the Afghan military.
We gave them every chance to determine their own future. What we could not provide them was the will to fight for that future.
But our own Ben Solomon was just in Afghanistan and says the failure to stop the Taliban had nothing to do with a lack of will. He joined me earlier today to talk about what he saw. Ben, thank you for joining us, and happy to see that you're back in the United States safely. I understand that you were in Kandahar in southern Afghanistan, that you were able to leave with the Afghan military as they were throwing down their weapons effectively on a cargo plane out of the city. What was that like?
So in the end, our experience in Kandahar was a problem because we got caught there. We got stranded. When we flew in on a commercial flight, the expectation was it'd take a few weeks, even when the fighting started to really get serious, we'd be able to kind of get out. What we didn't expect and we didn't foresee was that these soldiers would just so quickly give up the city. When it did happen, the airlines all shut down flights. The UN evacuation flights also shut down. Everything was shutting down. And when that was happening, we started to kind of worry what we were going to do. By the end, we found ourselves with one of the most elite units in the country called the 03 unit. They are CIA-trained, American-funded. These guys spent 20 years becoming the go-to military force that America relies upon in their stead. The U.S. never lets access to them, but in this case, it was so desperate that we just kind of found ourselves with them and protected with them. They were the ones preparing for what was going to be the last stand against the Taliban. They set up a front position right next to the airport, surrounded the area, kind of made a perimeter. And they said, this is it, we only have about 1,000 soldiers. The Taliban probably has a couple thousand, but we're going to fight all night. We're going to do everything we can. And we were getting ready for what was going to be one of the most harrowing, hairy nights of our lives. And just when the sun was about to go down, they announced that they had come to a truce. And the military commanders up top and the higher up in the military had decided to stand down, have their soldiers put down their weapons, give up all of their heavy gear, their Humvees, their artillery, all of their bigger weapons. They literally just left the cars running and went to the airfield, and the Taliban agreed to give a truce and let these planes fly in and fly everyone out. So in the middle of the night, at about 2 a.m., 6 carrier planes filled with just hundreds of military soldiers each. It was just a really intense scene of hundreds of people kind of packing in and trying to climb onto these. You see them now happening in Kabul, but then it was surprising to see these military units, basically like fighting for their lives to get out of there. And it was a really harrowing scene. Seeing in the distance, we could see the shots in the air of tracers, which were the Taliban shooting in the air and celebrating. And we could get the sense that, this was a bittersweet moment, because although they didn't have to fight and lose their lives, this was how the war was kind of faring for them, which is they were losing.
I think the story that people in Washington might be trying to tell is that the Afghan military forces had the resources they need, they just lacked the will to fight. From what you've seen and how it went down, what do you make of that?
I think it's an oversimplification. And we spent a lot of time on the front line with the fighters in Kandahar, and they were exhausted. So they were outgunned, they were underfed, they were undersupplied, and they just were exhausted by it all. So this idea that they didn't have the gumption, they didn't have the ability or the will to get into the fight, it's not true. And it's disrespectful of these people that were really fighting. And when the dominoes started falling and these people were all handing it over, the bigger reality is the soldiers that did want to fight didn't have the support. Thousands of Taliban guys compared to just a few hundred willing soldiers is not a fair fight.
I'm wondering what you're hearing about people on the ground that you have been in contact with who might be trying to get out, who are fearful of what a Taliban regime might entail in the near and the future, and what's going on.
It's the biggest problem right now is that the people that are trying to get out, it's not specific to people that work with the military or people that were interpreters. It's not just any one subset. It's everyone. Everyone in the country is looking for a way out, some way or another. I'm getting calls from high military officials asking if I know anybody that they can talk to.
They're calling you?
They're calling me, asking if I have some contacts at some embassy or something that they don't know about. I'm getting calls from all of the people we worked with looking for any way out. And there's really no answer. So now, we're living in this world where there's not a real thought going into what's going to happen with the Afghan people.
Well, thank you, Ben. Glad to see you're back safe. And there's so much more to talk about and to see from your reporting. So thanks so much.
Thanks.
We can hear around gunfirings. There is no one on the road, in the streets. We can only hear a gunfiring.
There were some armed men came to our block parking. They were screaming and shooting on the air. My family and my neighbor's family were screaming and crying for this.
As the Taliban advanced across Afghanistan, our reporters reached out to friends and contacts to find out how they were. These are the messages we got back.
Hello. Since last 2 weeks, especially last 3-4 days that we got information that Taliban will capture the capital, I lost myself.
We can't tell you their names because they're afraid for their lives, but we will keep bringing you their voices this week.
I don't have sleep. I cannot eat anything, and I am afraid of that. They will come to my home and kill me. Because I am a female activist, and now there will be no right for women. And I have a family. Yesterday, when I heard the Taliban enter to the Kabul, I just shocked. It was the hardest and the very worst condition that I have ever experienced. And I want that Americans know that our life is in danger.
The US government loves to say we don't negotiate with terrorists. But for the last few days, US military officials have been meeting in Doha trying to work out a deal with the Taliban that would protect Afghan civilians. Seb Walker is in Qatar tonight to get a sense of how the talks are going and if they're going to be able to save any lives. Seb, what are you hearing?
Well, Krishna, we are hearing those reports that you're probably referring to, that there was a conversation over the weekend with a senior US commander here from the US military's Central Command, which is located here in Qatar, and officials from the Taliban, representatives from the Taliban sitting down with the US military for a conversation about the unfolding situation on the ground. I mean, this is something which obviously we don't have access to. It's all happening behind closed doors. But one thing that I am hearing is that the US doesn't have a great deal of leverage left in this situation now that there's been this lightning advance with cities falling and finally Kabul falling to the Taliban fighters as well. There's not a lot of bargaining that the US can do in a situation like this, and it seems like the message was kind of along the lines of what we heard from President Biden earlier today, basically that the US will defend itself if there's any attack, and there should be, an evacuation allowed of American personnel and other civilians. But at this point, there's not really a huge amount of pressure that the US can bring to bear on the Taliban just because of what we've seen unfolding on the ground.
And wasn't that supposed to be the point of all those negotiations that took place there?
The nature of how things have collapsed in Afghanistan, everyone's very surprised. I've been speaking with officials who are also kind of astonished at what they're seeing unfolding. But I think one of the main points that they would make here is that the Americans gave a timeline for this, and that was something that they think was a strategic mistake. And I'm hearing that from various parties that, if you have a ticking clock down to the moment where you've said you're going to withdraw your forces, then really the Taliban has the advantage of being able to just wait it out. The famous expression is that from the Taliban side, you have the watches and we have the time. They have the time to wait, and that's how it's unfolded. And I think what I'm hearing here on the ground is that for the Afghan partners, for the US partners in Kabul, the Afghan government, there was an expectation that President Biden would draw this out a bit longer, that there would be some kind of change in policy from the Trump administration. That was a surprise to them. There was a moment where they thought with a new president, things are going to be halted. There's going to be some kind of reassessment. And they were pretty surprised by all accounts of the way that this policy continued.
Thanks for that, Seb. Hind Hassan has been reporting on Afghanistan over the past year. This spring, she and her team snuck into Taliban-controlled territory, putting their safety in the hands of the Taliban themselves. While there, she saw firsthand how the Islamist group runs a government and doles out justice.
There's little due process in these Sharia courts. Disputes here are settled by mobile justice, and in some cases, Taliban commanders who have the autonomy to carry out punishments how they see fit. He just smacked him. What you're seeing right now is pretty much a Taliban court. You have in front of me is a local Taliban commander talking to somebody who's been accused of stealing. Surrounded by a group of Taliban fighters, the accused is forced to give a deposition to camera about whether he stole sheep from a local herder, as well as other crimes. He's been sitting in Taliban jail since his arrest and has no representation at this hearing.
بدون د نور څومره غلې کړی ته
نمیدی کړي
کتر باندې ثابت شو
کله باندې ثابت شو لاس مې باندې وځه
خو ته په دوه باندې منکر وې اړیزه چا در باندې وکړه
د وری چک تندرای څلور ورځې باندې وم په باندې خونه کې
خو کې دی ورای په لاس ورکو
ورامي په لاس ورکو
راز د چای په شو کې دی وری
آخی خورمه
خو پوینده که خود بیا سوال نخوری
نه دست جاکو بیا نه وان دست اشتباه بیا نه
صحیح شو کنه
In terms of the cases that you've dealt with today, what are the potential punishments that they could be served in the end?
اوس داسې د غټ غلو دپاره مثلا د لاس وڅول شته کې کنه د غټ غلو دپاره او د غوځو کوم چې دا اوس په هغو جرم کې دی راشي څه شی چې په شریعت کې ورته شته څه شی چې په قرآن کې دغه دلته موږ په تطبیق کوو.
The man that was sat in front of you that was accused of stealing, potentially, at the end of the court case, he might have his hand cut off.
هغلته د دوی خپل اصول او طرز العمل شته نو انشاءالله خود شته ولې نه.
Human rights organizations would look at this scene and see men who don't have representatives, who don't have anybody putting forward their case, who have people who don't necessarily have the judicial or legal experience to be able to be handing out punishments, deciding the fate of an individual. And they would say that that isn't justice. What would you say to them?
نو دا سوال د احمقانه دی د موږ هر زده کړه د موږ هر عمل د موږ هر کردار د موافق او مطابق د قرآن او د شریعت دی اضافه نور هیڅ شی نشته کې.
So is this the justice system that you would like to see implemented in Kabul and across Afghanistan?
نو دا خو عملی دی په دوی کې شک نشته. هغه ساحې چې د امارات کنټرول لاندې دي اسلامي امارات کنټرول لاندې په هغو کې په قطعا دغه د قرآن او د شریعت غږ دی او همدغه عملي کول نور هیڅ شی نشته کې.
Would you consider bringing back stoning if you were to be in government? Is that something that you would do for adultery?
دغه زنا دپاره بالکل جزا شته. اک سنگسار و که کومه جزا چې په شریعت کې ورته مطابق دغه حال سره به کتل کېږي دغه د سن سره به کتل کېږي دغه د بخش دي کې ټول کې ذکر دي. کوم شای چې په قرآن او په شریعت کې ورته کومه جزا و هغه جزا مطابق د جزا سره دغه شته دی.
Hind joins me now from Turkey. Hind, you spent some time with the Taliban. What was that like, and what did you learn about what Afghanistan might be underneath them?
Yeah, it was quite surreal. We spent around 5 days and 2 nights with the Taliban, and what was really clear was just how powerful they were, and that despite what was coming out of Kabul or Washington, the Taliban had absolutely no intention to take part in intra-Afghan talks, which would lead to them integrating into what was the current political system in Kabul. In terms of their strength, they have a whole new generation of fighters. Some of them weren't even born when the war began. They were all armed, and they also showed us how to make their weapon of choice, which was IEDs. And in terms of the older fighters, they had an incredible knowledge of the region and the terrain. And regardless of what capabilities you had as an army, the United States and their allies, or even the Afghan government, would find it, and they did find it, impossible to battle against something like that. In terms of the future and what that holds for Afghanistan, we also spoke and spent some time with the Afghan government around 7 months ago, and we spoke to the National Security Advisor, Hamdullah Mohib. In a conversation when we were speaking about potential intra-Afghan talks and where they were going, because at that point they were failing quite significantly, he told me that he still believed that they could convince the Taliban to take part in a democratic system or in their current political system.
We think that democracy is the best way or the best system because in that the Taliban can exist.
Do you really believe that the Taliban would ever support a democracy? Do you honestly believe that?
I think we can convince them.
And it was clear even back then that that was a complete fantasy, because every time we would speak to the Taliban, every time we'd have a conversation, we'd put to them what the government had said to us. And we would ask them, do you have any intention in partaking in these intra-Afghan talks and integrating into the political system? And their answer would be repeatedly no. Their intention has always been to rule Afghanistan and for Afghanistan to adhere to their very specific interpretation of Islamic law.
Well, thank you, Hind, for your reporting, and we'll talk again, I'm sure. That's Hind Hassan, who's in Turkey. Tonight, we've been following the crisis in Afghanistan. And now we turn to its impact on American politics. Republicans are obviously blasting President Biden for allowing the situation to get so bad. But that outrage is bipartisan. Liz Landers reports from D.C.
President Biden returned today to the White House from Camp David and addressed the nation, saying that he stands by his decision to withdraw American troops from Afghanistan. Of course, there's political point scoring happening right now, but there are even some Democrats who are expressing their frustrations with the way this evacuation has been handled.
My problem is with how the withdrawal is going, how it's being managed, and what's clearly a lack of planning that's prevented many of our American citizens and allies from getting out safely until this point.
Do you think he addressed those concerns?
No, he barely mentioned them, and he made an excuse that just doesn't hold any water for not evacuating our Afghan allies, which is that many of them don't want to come. Look, there's been a backlog of visas since I came to Congress. And if you just look at the pictures coming out of Kabul right now, there are thousands of Afghans clamoring at the gates of the airport to get out. So don't tell me that they don't want to come.
Are you getting emails, calls, tweets about those special immigration visas that you mentioned?
I was on the phone till very late last night with an Afghan American trying to get his wife here. My team and I have been dealing with this really for months, but especially over the last 72 hours. The other thing I'm doing is I'm continuing to pressure the administration to do the right thing. There's still time to save innocent lives. And that depends on the administration's response and what the military and the State Department are willing to do over the next few days. So I know some people think that I'm being quite critical of the administration as a fellow Democrat. Look, I love Joe Biden, and I agree with much of what this administration has done. But to say that this is going fine right now would be dishonest, and I'm not going to do that.
Brett Bruin, Global Engagement Director during the Obama White House, says that President Biden might need to consider firing his national security advisor in the wake of what has transpired in the last few days.
Has all the work that you and 4 presidential administrations put into Afghanistan been undone at this point?
I would say not only has it been undone, we're in a worse spot. The Taliban is able to use American military equipment and know-how. They are battle-hardened from 2 decades of fighting our forces. And they also have the value, the propaganda value of having waited us out. And, in their words, I'm sure, won an important victory.
What do people fail to understand about what has happened in the last 72 hours in the last week?
I think there is not an appreciation for the broader impact. A lot of people are focused on the shiny object and not looking over the horizon. How is this going to impact our relations around the region and across the globe? That's where I fear we are going to see the next wave of reverberations. We're going to see the next wave of impact, because there are a whole lot of allies that are having emergency meetings right now, reviewing their relations with the U.S., reviewing the vulnerabilities. Where's the next place that Joe Biden is going to decide is no longer worth America's engagement?
That's it for Vice News tonight. Make sure to tune in throughout this week. We're going to stay on top of this situation in Afghanistan, and you can catch all the latest at vice.com.